bird program. And in my day job, I do work on conservation of migratory songbirds primarily. And we've been doing this bird banding there at Fort River this was our 7th year. And so we're going to give you a few of the details behind what goes on when we do the banding that we do there. Laura, do you mind if I ask, can people do their raise the hand thing if you've done bird banding in some way, participated or watched before, just to get a sense of how familiar folks are with what bird banding is about?
Sure. So if everyone looks at the bottom of your screen, if you move your cursor, you can see the reaction tab. And if you click on that, you can choose a thumbs up if you want to show a thumbs up that you have seen or heard of bird banding, or raise your hand, or whichever works for you.
Great. So it looks like a fair number of folks have, so that's good. So that just gives us a sense of maybe how many details to go into and where we can focus our presentation a little bit. So I am going to share my screen here and get our presentation started. And let's
Coming up. There we go. We see it.
All right. Am I in presentation mode? Oops, I'm not at the beginning. Hold on a second.
And now you are.
It's usually good to start at the beginning.
Oops, now it flipped back. There
okay. How's that?
That's perfect.
Great. All right.
What a shot.
Yeah, so this is we'll talk about the birds too, but this is definitely one of the highlights of bird banding that we've done there at Fort River, worm-eating warbler. And what we've discovered is that it seems that while worm-eating warblers probably aren't breeding right there at Fort River, they think it's a good place to go after they're done breeding, in the Holyoke Range or Mount Tom or wherever they might be in the vicinity. So that's one of the interesting kind of tidbits we've learned through this process. But what we're doing with our bird banding is participating in the Monitoring Avian Productivity and Survivorship program, which is a national program organized by the Institute for Bird Populations in California. And it's been operating since 1989. So about that time back in the 80s, when there was more and more recognition and acknowledgement of declines in neotropical migratory birds, and the conservation community was really trying to push for getting some understanding of what was causing these declines. And the folks at the Institute for Bird Population said, well, we really need to collect more demographic information on these various species, and that'll help us to get at least a sense of, from a demographic population level sense, what's really driving declines or population changes of different species. So the basic goals and objectives are just that, to really collect information on what they call vital rates. So things like survivorship, productivity, breeding productivity, and survivorship, and an index of adults to juveniles in different populations. And then by some of the fantastic statistical methods that we have, using band recoveries and capture recapture sorts of methods, they're taking all that information and estimating these different demographic rates for many different species. And so, the basic, really quick description of what it is it's a constant effort misnetting protocol that's followed. So you do, the same amount of the number of nets, the number of hours you have the nets open, broken up through the breeding period. So, in our area, it's pretty much from early June to the end of July or the first part of August, and do that year after year, and collect information on age and sex and body condition of the different birds. And over a period of time, we get an amazing data set to try and get some hints as to what might be driving population changes in these different birds, from the sense of, well, is it about productivity, nesting success, and survival at different periods? Is it the young coming back and surviving that overwinter period? Is it adult survival in general? So there's just a wealth of information. And when we started this 7 years ago, we were kind of realizing that there weren't a lot of active MAPS stations, banding stations in Massachusetts. At one point in time, there were a fair number, but many of those have, for various reasons, stopped being run anymore. And we felt that with the Fort River property having been, acquired by the Fish and Wildlife Service as part of the Conte Refuge, it was just a great location to do something like this. And so, the MAPS program over that time, since 1989, there have actually been over 1,200 different stations that have operated for some period of time over that time frame. Typically, there are somewhere between 300 to 500 different stations that are operated any given year. And you can see that it's spread throughout the United States, into parts of Canada, and up into Alaska as well. With a big concentration here in the east and the northeast, where there are a lot of folks interested in birds and bird banding. And as I said, we really looked at the Fort River division of the Conte Refuge as a prime location for doing this kind of work. Its location in terms of the landscape, where it provides some forested, streamside habitat, which can be extremely valuable for birds. But a mixture of different, forest ages, or some early successional habitat, the grasslands, obviously. So it's a diversity of habitats that attract a diversity of birds. And of course, now being part of a national wildlife refuge, it provides that sort of long-term stability for monitoring birds over a long period of time. We also like that it was, only a couple of miles from the regional office where Caleb and I spend most of our time, but also, very close proximity to University of Massachusetts and the other colleges in the area. We saw this as also an opportunity to try and interact with the education community in the area, and can sort of serve as a training grounds for, the next generation of bird biologists who want to learn about these things as well. And so we've really found that to be true over the period that we've done this. We've had great participation from students at UMass, as well as the colleges in the area. We've had a lot of people from our office who come out and participate for a day or two. And it's been just a great opportunity to sort of share the knowledge about birds that we can do when we have birds in the hand, and look at them closely, and talk about things like, how do we age, a bird, and how do we tell what its breeding status is, and those sorts of things. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about, some of the things we have to consider when we start a MAP station. And so obviously there's just the banding permits. We have to have permits to band birds, both at the federal and state level. And so you can see an example of my federal bird banding permit on the right there. It basically tells you, what you can and can't do in terms of what birds you're authorized to band, location, what methods of capture, and then you can add sub-permittees as well. And you have to go through a process to submit them, basically your resume of what kind of banding you've done in the past, and show that you've had enough training and are prepared for the type of banding work that you want to do. And these days, I think the Federal Bird Banding Lab in particular wants to make sure that you are doing this as part of, a scientific endeavor. So you're part of a program like MAPS, or you have a particular research question that you're trying to answer. So sort of the days of people just kind of going out and banding birds for, not necessarily for fun, but just because, it's a good thing to do, and it's it can be educational in a lot of ways. But the Bird Banding Lab is really trying to focus on the scientific value of bird banding. And in addition to, just thinking about that, then there's also just the awareness of always making sure that we're doing this in a safe way for birds, and thinking about the safety of the birds as we do this. So always being aware of, following the proper protocols, making sure we're checking nets frequently, keeping track of the weather, and just keeping an eye on the condition of the birds. So anytime you start seeing birds that look like, they're overheating, or they're too cold, or too stressed out, we have to keep an eye on that and make sure that we release birds if they're showing too much sign of stress. And let's see, my presentation has stopped advancing. So I will.
Sometimes if you get out of the speaker mode and then back again, that might help.
Oh, there it go. And so, if you haven't been up close, at a bird banding location before, basically there are different size bands that fit the legs of different size birds, but they all have a very small engraved number on them. So it's like an ID bracelet that we put on the birds, and so we'll know if we catch that particular individual bird again in the future, it will have that number, and we'll know that it was here before. And so the MAPS protocol is pretty much, to try and again standardize the number of nets, the size of nets, sort of the arrangement of nets across all the MAP stations that are being run. And so we use nets that are 12 meters in length, and these nets come in different mesh sizes, depending on the size of birds that you're anticipating catching. And so the 30-meter mesh size is a good size for your typical songbird, sparrows and warblers and vireos, blue jays, cardinals, anything in that size range is good for catching with a 30-meter size mesh. If you're going to try and catch larger birds, you probably want a larger mesh net. And then we use 4-tier nets, and so there are basically 4 sort of layers going up where birds can get caught, and they're made of black nylon, so they're quite they sort of disappear into the background when the conditions are right. And you can see sort of on the left here is one of our nets in this area. And when we're looking for places to set the nets, we're really kind of looking for these situations where there is some low vegetation, at the ground and sort of mid-story, where birds won't be likely, occupying that space, and then hopefully moving through a place where we'll have a little bit of an opening so we can set the net in an open space, but with lots of vegetation around it. And then again, sort of the MAPS protocol calls for typically 10 nets within about a 20 hectare area. And so this is the map of the nature trail at Fort River. And we have the numbers, the red numbers are where our nets are located. So it's not, you know, sort of completely systematic in where they're laid out. We're allowed some flexibility to find those locations that we think will be good for capturing birds, but try not to have them too close to each other so that we spread it out, and also try and have nets in the different sort of habitat types that are within a particular site. And yeah, the sort of goal that we're shooting for is a density of about 1 to 2 nets per hectare. Again, sort of somewhat evenly spread out across about a 20 hectare area, with some flexibility to find those places that you think are going to be good for catching birds. And so here's another example of one of our net locations. And then the constant effort part of it, again, there are sort of protocols that we have to follow. So we aren't out there catching and banding birds every day. The protocol for MAPS is that we do 1 banding session for every 10-day period throughout the breeding season. And so they have these periods, as you can see in the little table in the middle there. Period 1 starts in May, at the beginning of May, for all of MAPS. As the map above it shows, the period at which you start your sessions for the summer depends on your latitude. And so we're in period 4, so we don't start banding until that period that starts in May 31st and goes through June 9th. And then for each of those 10-day periods after that, we try and fit in 1 banding session throughout the rest of the summer, the breeding period, until, you know, roughly the end of June or the first week of August. And then sort of the minimum effort part of it is that MAPS wants you to make sure you have at least 3 banding sessions during what they call the adult super period. So that beginning part of the summer, when you're capturing mostly adults, there aren't a whole lot of juveniles who are out and about yet at that point in time. And so that helps with, again, sort of estimating the adult population at a particular site, and capturing, you know, as many of those adults as we can early in the season. And then you also have to make sure you hit 2 of the periods for the young super period. And those are the periods when we expect that we're going to be catching probably nearly as many juveniles as adults during any banding session. And then we keep track of all that sort of net effort. So how many hours is each of the nets open on any particular banding day? If you know, for some reason, you know, weather or other unexpected situations, you have to close the nets early, or you can't start as early as you wanted to. You keep track of that, and then you're supposed to try and make up those hours as soon after, you know, that particular day as you can, and sort of do it during the time frame that you missed, so that you have an even amount of net effort during each of those 10-day periods. And if for some reason you happen to, you know, not be able to fit it in during the 10-day period, you're allowed to sort of sneak it into the next one by a few days, and call that your, you know, your effort for the previous time. And I'm going to hand it over to Caleb for the next part.
Thanks, Randy. Appreciate it, and appreciate being here. I'm Caleb Spiegel. I have the honor of working with Randy at the MAP station. I've been around since the beginning. In my day job, I am a wildlife biologist that studies marine birds and shorebirds, but I've been kind of a journeyman in my career and have spent a lot of time with songbirds too. So I really love to get to work on this project. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the setup, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the operation of the station itself. But you know, the this is the station requires a lot of equipment. It's good to have helpers to carry it from the parking lot. And so of course, one of the main things that we need is bands and banding pliers, so that we can, identify one. And then there's this band gauge, we have to sometimes identify what size band to put on the bird. There are a number of different sizes depending on the size of the leg. And then it's pretty well established what size most birds get, but sometimes we have to measure them. Then we will band the bird with pliers. We use a lot of different field guides for identification of the actual species if needed, but also there's this thing called the pile guide, which is sort of like the one-stop stop shopping for understanding about how to age and sex a bird based on plumages and other characteristics, which I'll talk about in a minute, and Randy and I will. Wing ruler for measuring the wing, scale and weighing cups. That's the pile guide that had the arrow now, and then there's the weighing cups. They actually go into the cups. You'll see it in that picture. That's the tail sticking out of the cup. That a lot of people think that's kind of crazy. Is the bird hurt? No, not at all. They actually are somewhat relaxed in the cup, and we're able to get a weight. Water, we use water for sculling, which Randy will talk about in a little while. Data sheets, of course, for collecting the data. The MAPS manual, which just talks about how to do things in a consistent manner according to MAPS protocol. Cheat sheets is this is how we kind of can be consistent in how we are collecting data, and don't have to read through the whole book to try and figure out every little detail. These cheat sheets are handy. Of course, there's a bird first aid kit should something unexpected happen, but thankfully that is exceptionally rare for a bird to ever be injured. Tables and chair, of course, for our comfort, but mostly for putting all that stuff on top. Sanitizer and wipes, insect repellent, because we get a lot of mosquitoes out at Fort River, particularly as the season progresses, and coffee and donuts, of course. If we're lucky, we have someone like Randy bring in coffee and donuts for us. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we run the station. And the first thing is that we open nets on a banding day 30 minutes before sunrise. So it's an early day, but we wake up with the birds, as I'm sure a lot of you do when you're birding, and that's when they're active, most active right after sunrise. So we want to open the nets a little bit before. The nets are checked every 30 minutes, and the reason that we do this is just to make sure that birds don't get too tangled or injure themselves when they're in the net. So every 30 minutes is sort of a requirement. We then, as you can see in this picture, someone that has experience taking a bird out of the net takes the bird out, puts it in a bag, and returns it to the banding station. You can see then we hang them on a hook that the bag's on the hook, and that corresponds to a net and a time. So we'll know which birds came from which place, so that when we're recording the data, we remember. Sometimes we'll get 5 to 10, if we're lucky, 5 to 10 birds in a run, and then we really need to use these hooks. Nets are closed after about 6 hours. Well, actually, after we're supposed to do, the protocol says 6 hours. So if there's anything less, it's usually related to weather, but we don't stay open more than 6 hours. Next slide. And so another part of the MAPS protocol involves making observations of all birds that you see and hear during your session. And of course, we have a lot of volunteers coming in, as Randy said, but we, with this group at Fort River, we tend to have a lot of experienced birders that come in. So when we put our heads together and come up with these species lists, we generally have taken account of everything that is in the area, either by sound or by sight. And for these species, we also note behaviors. And the big thing about this is it provides insight into breeding status. So we're, if a bird is carrying nesting material, or if we see, if we're lucky enough to see a nest or an adult feeding chicks, that's noted. And then these lists are all recorded on a data sheet. For every single day that we operate the nets. Next. So this is the fun part. Of course, you get the bird, and I would say also the real challenging part. You get the bird back to the banding station in the bag. It's hanging on a hook, and you have someone hands you a bird, or you take the bird out yourself. The bird is then banded with a unique numbered metal band. Each band is unique, so it's sort of like a social security number. And that bird, there will be no other bird that is banded with that unique identification. So that way we always know individual for the whole bird's life after it's banded. And then we collect a whole bunch of data on the birds. And, one thing you can tell is usually, pretty relatively easy as species, but occasionally, with the maybe some of the flycatchers, there can be some confusion about species, but in general, we know generally by looking at them. But then it starts to get a little more complicated. Sex, sometimes that's easy, sometimes it's not, depends on the species. But the species that look the same, there are ways to evaluate that through breeding condition and plumage. For age, there are ways to tell the age through plumage, molt patterns, and skull, and Randy will talk about that in a minute. Breeding status is also noted because that's really important to know whether the birds are breeding, and particularly when they're breeding. And then we measure body condition by looking at the amount of fat on the body, and there's certain places on the bird that this collects. And that really changes throughout the season. Birds don't generally have a lot of fat when they are in the middle of breeding. They're expending all that energy on their offspring, but then they start putting on fat before they migrate. Stage of molt and molt patterns are also noted. And again, there's a lot of things that you can say with this, but some of them have to do with age, subspecies, things of that nature. And then we take the weight, and you get a really good record over many years and many stations of everybody doing the same thing about variability. And it's really an amazing data set. And I want to point out here, just in this bright blue bird, the second to the left is a indigo bunting male, and you can see somebody looking at the tail and the PIO guide underneath and trying to understand maybe what they're looking at in the plumage. So that's just kind of an example of doing some plumage work in a collection of data. Next slide. I don't know if you're frozen again, but
it's
slide.
coming.
Okay, slowly but surely. Yeah, and you can see again another image of weighing a bird and all the equipment on the table, which is substantial. But it's ordered chaos for sure, and it's really useful to have helpers out there for recording data. Lots of people to check your work, particularly with plumages. You're like, is this considered tapered, or it's is this feather looking abraded, and what is the? So anyway, there's a lot of use for a lot of people out there, and we're thankful that we have a lot of help. I am still seeing the same slide. I don't know, Randy, if you're
apologize.
Still having trouble.
I am frozen up.
Oh, that's okay. And so you can see obviously a blue jay there. I think Randy might maybe weighing well, I'm not exactly sure what that is in that picture. It's kind of hard to tell just from the tail end. But then we do get brown thrashers occasionally too. That's what I'm banding there in that picture. And it's always a treat. They're pretty cool birds. All right, so after doing that, thanks, Randy. The next thing that we do is release the bird, and the bird is now, we have all the information and individual identity. And these birds, this is the really amazing thing about maps, is that a lot of these birds will breed, have offspring, will have a good record of them having, when they were tagged. A lot of times they're tagged as hatch years, so we know how old they are. And then they'll fly off and migrate away, and then they'll come back, and most species come back pretty much to where they were hatched, very, very close. And so, and certainly where they come back to, and this is really common, is you have the same, once a bird establishes a territory, it'll come back to that same territory year after year. And so a lot of times they get recaptured, and when we have a bird that's recaptured, we know who it is, and we're able to see how it's changed throughout the year or years. Maybe it's a little heavier, maybe it's changed plumages, and then we also have an idea of how old it is. So again, this data is really useful. Next slide. So you may wonder, well, if you can't, so I'm going to say some species here, it's really obviously important to tell sex. That's one of the key pieces of data that we're collecting. And for some species, like this red-breasted grosbeak in the center picture, it's pretty easy. The males and females, these two lower pictures, they look different. These grosbeaks, that female on the right and the male on the left. Things like cardinals, and I don't have to tell you, you're birders. So, but that's called being sexually dimorphic, and so easy to say, oh, this is a male or this is a female. The exception to that is when they're young. Sometimes males and females look the same, but as they get older, generally they look different. But what happens when you have a species like a catbird or a titmouse, which we get a lot of catbirds and titmice at our station. These are called sexually monomorphic, and the cool thing about this is that a lot of times these species can be sexed by either what we call a cloacal protuberance in males or a brood patch in females. And next slide, I'll show you what that looks like. So several species, well, really most species, the females lose the feathers on their breast when they're incubating eggs and brooding young chicks. And this is an example of what that looks like in a female cardinal that's in the middle of breeding condition. And it kind of changes over the course of the season. The first thing is they lose their feathers. It looks just like smooth skin. And then it starts to become kind of vascularized and heavy with blood, like this one. And then it starts to get sort of lose some of that after, further along in the season, losing that swelled kind of vascularized look, and it looks more wrinkled. And then it kind of goes back to a smooth condition, and you start to see feathers growing back in. So a lot of times, though not always, you can tell that a bird is a female. And of course, with this cardinal, you would have known it was a female. But if this had been something like a chickadee, and it had this brood patch, you would know that that was a female chickadee. Now, there are some species, including some woodpeckers and other species, where males also do some incubation. And this makes it confusing sometimes or at least not reliable for knowing whether or not you have a male or a female just because it's got a brood patch. So so it's not always reliable, but in I would say the vast majority of species, a brood patch tells you whether or not it tells you that it's a female. Even more reliable for telling a male or a female is cloacal protuberance. And basically, this is sort of the vent area of a male black-capped chickadee, and you can see this little bump here right in the middle that Randy is pointing to with the cursor. That is a male in breeding condition, and you can tell because the females, they don't get that swollen look to that area, which is their sexual organ, and it's also where they excrete waste. But the females don't look like that. They don't look swollen. They look a lot more just like a little bump. The males will get really swollen. That's considered medium. When they're really swollen. They look almost like a mushroom. So that's kind of another really reliable way of telling a male from a female in a species that looks the same. And like I was saying, sometimes there's some overlap with females, but for the vast majority of cloacal protuberances are only found in males. So I'm now going to turn it back over to Randy, and he's going to tell you about how to age a bird that you might not know how old they are.
All right, thanks, Caleb. So determining age is a very important part of the MAPS sort of protocol. And what we really want to try and do is, be able to identify birds as either juveniles. Hopefully, we can identify them when they are what we call in their second year birds, or after second year. And that's because if we band a bird as a juvenile, we really want to try and be able to estimate that juvenile survival into the next year. And so there are now sort of two major aging systems that were both being used as part of MAPS. The original sort of first system was the system of identifying birds as being in their hatch year, and it went by calendar, by basically calendar period. So if let's say a bird was hatched in May, and then in June, once they hatch, they will start growing their first set of feathers, and we'll call those the juvenile feathers. And then for many passerine birds, songbirds, sometime sort of later in the summer or during the fall, they will molt some of those original juvenile feathers. And that's kind of what this picture is depicting, but not all of them, not the entire body. And so this is called the formative molt. And then they'll keep some of those new feathers into the next year. They'll keep those right through the next breeding season. So again, May, June, they'll still have those same set of partial juvenile feathers, partial newer formative feathers. And that's typically what we're trying to look for in terms of aging birds. And then once they get through their first breeding period and into that late summer, early fall, they'll go through another molt, and this will be a complete molt. They'll drop all the feathers, grow new feathers, and now they're in what we call the basic plumage. And so, there's these sort of stages of different plumage cycles, starting with juvenile, and then formative, and then basic once they get past their sort of first breeding season and into third year or beyond. More recently, there's a system called the Wolf-Rider-Pyle system, which is kind of based on some of the differences that birds in the tropics have, where they aren't so tied to a breeding season during our summer, and they really could be breeding and nesting and hatching birds just about any time of the year. And so this system is really based more on these molt cycles rather than tied to a particular time of the calendar year. And so you don't really think of them as hatch year or second year, but more in terms of which molting cycle are they into. And so it starts with, again, that juvenile plumage after they come out of the nest. And part of what we're always looking for when we have birds in the hand is whether there's any active molt going on, because that will be an indication, that the bird is kind of switching between these different molt cycles, these different plumages. And so they'll go from the juvenile into the formative, and then after that, again, it'll be a basic molt is pretty much anything after that formative molt. And then, after that first initial sort of breeding season, it all becomes a basic molt again. Now, some species also have what we call an alternate molt, particularly the more colorful songbirds. At some point later, typically in the winter, as they're beginning to prepare for the next breeding season, they will again molt some part of their body feathers, often into the most colorful, breeding plumage that they can get. And so that molt is an additional molt that's called the alternate molt. And then they'll go through the breeding season in their alternate plumage. And after the breeding season, again, they'll do a complete molt of their body and be back into a basic molt. And so those are the things we're really looking for. One of the key features that we're looking for are these retained juvenile feathers. And this is a pretty good example here with a wood thrush. Many of the thrushes, the juvenile feathers, if you can see right in this area, there's some sort of light brown tips at the ends of these feathers. And that's kind of a key indication that these are juvenile feathers that were, retained from the previous year. So this is a second-year bird, or a bird that we would say is in a formative plumage. And then there are probably we kind of look at entire feather tracts on the feathers of the wings of these birds. And there are some feathers back here and closer to the body that are all part of that secondary covert track of feathers. And they look darker brown and don't have any of those light tips. And so those are probably feathers that were molted into that formative. So literally this bird, a second-year bird, has a combination of formative and juvenile feathers, and that's kind of what we're looking for. And then there are, oddballs like this bird, which is a second-year American redstart that's beginning to show its alternate plumage, where it's losing its yellowish plumage and getting more of the orange and beginning to show some of that black that it will eventually have as a full adult. Juveniles typically are relatively easy to detect or identify compared to second-year or older birds, based on things like the gape. This area at the back of the mouth is usually lighter. And we say that they have a frown because it kind of curls down at the end. So younger birds tend to have sort of lighter gapes. They have more of those baby feathers, just kind of fluffy feathers all around the body. Feather color. This is actually a juvenile downy woodpecker. All juvenile downy woodpeckers have red on the top of the head. And then once they molt out of their juvenile feathers, the males will get the red at the back of the neck, and the females will lose the red color. And then the bird on the right here is a juvenile common yellowthroat. But again, sort of see a bunch of that sort of baby feathers, very fluffy feathers is typical. And then for some birds, the iris color also changes between juveniles and older birds. So we can see that. And then the other thing we look at is the skulls of birds. And so most birds have sort of translucent skin on the top of their head. And like human babies, the skull development is such that when they first leave the nest, the skull is not fully formed, fully ossified on the top. And as they, advance in age, the skull will grow in and come to a complete, fully ossified skull. And so over that period of time, during that juvenile period, we can try and sort of look at the skulls of birds and get a sense of, based on the amount of ossification that we see, get a sense of how old that bird is. And obviously, if you see a skull that's not completely ossified, that usually is an indication of a juvenile, although some species can retain a little bit of a window in that skull into the second year. So just a few, sort of summaries of what we've seen so far over our 7 years of banding at Fort River. So we've at total, we've banded 45 different species over that period of time, listed on the left there. You can see there's a pretty good smattering of warblers. As Caleb was talking about, we've caught both alder and willow flycatcher and eastern phoebe and eastern wood pewee, which when you have them in the hand, it can be a little confusing to start out with, but we have some good cheat sheets for figuring those out. We've caught an orchard oriole a couple times. We fairly regularly catch brown thrashers that are there, which are pretty neat. And then the rest of these species, are ones that I think you would probably expect would probably be there. By and large, so we've now banded a little under 1,000 birds over that period of time and had a bit over 300 recaptures of birds we've banded there. But the vast majority of the birds that we catch and band are gray catbirds. Probably no surprise, very abundant bird at Fort River. Perfect habitat for them. So they by and far, are the winners in terms of birds that we catch there. But then there are a number of species like wood thrush and song sparrow and robin, where we've caught, over 60 individuals over that period of time. And then another handful we've caught, at least 20 species. And then the rest of them on that list, we've, caught anywhere between 1 and probably 10 or 12 birds. So we have kind of the smallest of birds that we have as regular visitors, and then the rest of them just kind of depends on the year and whether they happen to be around. And in terms of, we're definitely seeing some annual variation over the years, which isn't surprising either. But both in terms of the total number of captures, the percent of juveniles that we capture, and then the total number of recaptures. And so, kind of went up from our first year, we had somewhere around 130 birds that we banded. The next season was a good one, and we had over 160. We've had a couple years that were more in the range of 120, which this past season was in that range. And it does seem to be somewhat tied to weather patterns, where drier years like this summer, we tend not to catch as many birds, and we tend not to see as many juveniles in our captures as well. And then wetter years tend to be the years where we have a lot of birds there and seem to have a lot of productivity. And so, over this period of time, we've felt that it really has shown that for the most part, Fort River is really good breeding habitat for these birds that we're catching, and also serves as post-breeding habitat. As we talked about, the worm-eating warbler and even a species like ovenbird that we don't actually have right within our study site. Those are species that we catch right at the end of summer, after they've probably, had a brood and are done breeding, and then are looking for some place to go as a good post-breeding habitat. And in terms of the larger, efforts of the MAPS program, it really has been a wealth of information on different species. So the Institute for Bird Populations has taken all this data from across the country, and they've now done the temporal and spatial analyses of 158 different land birds in North America. And as just one example here with wood thrush, it has shown that changes in wood thrush populations really seem to be driven both by adult survival and what they call post-breeding effects, which is really mostly first-year survival and then recruitment into the breeding population. And so, those two factors really seem to be driving the overall changes in wood thrush populations, and really seem to be pointing towards, problems with survival of both adults and first-year birds during the non-breeding season. And we're going to finish up just kind of mentioning a little bit more about the aspects of people and maps. So we typically have about 5 to 8 regular volunteers that are there in any given year helping us. And then, we've had over a dozen sort of the young professionals, the students from UMass and other colleges who come and learned burn banding at the station. Caleb, I don't know if you want to mention a little bit more on this slide or the next one.
I guess I'll go to the next one and I can talk about a couple of other things. Yeah, I think, like Randy was saying, this station, one of the reasons that Randy had, I think, the foresight to see this as a really good location was not just because it was going to be really interesting from a perspective of birds and bird diversity, but and not just that it was close to the regional office. It's also in an area that, because of how close it is to the universities, because of how close it is to the regional office, because of the fact that there's a number of people that are really interested in the outdoors around here. We thought this would be a really good place for to have people come and learn about birds, and not just people that maybe had some experience with, like Randy was saying, there's a lot of people that learned to band at this station, a lot of young professionals, but we also have a lot of people that come from school classes and camps to learn about banding and to see birds in the hand for the first time. The reactions that you see from people that are seeing a bird in the hand, be they young, like these kids in this one picture, real little to adults, is just amazing. I feel like it is a really strong way to connect people to nature and to get them excited about being outdoors. We've also done, not only had people come to visit us at the banding station, but we've done banding demonstrations at a number of schools in the area, including in Springfield. We're about to do one actually in early October there. We've done them at Conway and Amherst, and so that's been also really great to go to where the students are and show them that not only that birds are cool and they're really interesting, but also that there is a job out there that is called wildlife biology, and they can do that job. That's also been a really cool message that we've been able to spread through these banding demonstrations and through people coming to the station. And I should definitely mention that in addition, to the public and to young professionals, we also have people that are working, that are in college, or other professionals that they're doing actively doing research, and our station has been used to collect information for some research projects over the years as well. So it's a multi-use station for sure, and in addition to getting that really useful information on demography, we also are able to spread the word about how cool birds are, and to get some people out there in nature and seeing birds in their natural environment. And that's all I have about that slide. I think just got one more.
No, I think we just want to acknowledge some of those folks and give a shout out to our colleagues at the Refuge, who have been extremely supportive of what we're doing there, and always lend a hand, and have helped communicate some of the things that we're doing there through their website and Facebook pages and things like that. And you can see the names of some of the folks who have been sort of regular banders and some of the trainees and so forth. And Raymar Gutierrez was an important person in helping me to get this whole process going as well. So I just wanted to acknowledge those folks. And with that, I think we will definitely stop. And if folks have time for some questions, we'd be happy to take them.
Sure, I think we do have a couple questions. I'm just going to look through the chat here. Let's see. It says, anything you can add regarding habitats at Fort River, birds/breeding birds at those habitats, values of different habitats throughout the season?
Yeah, well, I think the thing that I would add is just, there are a diversity of habitats there. There's, it's sort of some older mature forest areas right along the river. There are some younger stands of aspen and just some earlier successional habitats that are now beginning to succeed. And then obviously the grasslands. So just having that diversity obviously brings in a diversity of birds. And we with the setup of our nets, we can obviously document that there is that diversity of birds that are in breeding condition in pretty much all of those habitats. And so it's been pretty apparent to us that, the birds really do well in terms of that area as breeding habitat. And then, as I mentioned, seeing some of those other species that we don't see during the main part of the breeding season show up there at the end of the summer, like the worm-eating warbler, is an indication to us that it's also a really good place for birds that are looking for a good place to molt and do that important business of their life cycle in a place that probably has a good food source and enough cover where the birds can feel safe during that sort of period where they're more vulnerable while they're molting. So I think we have a lot of indications that the variety of habitats there are really good for the bird community as a whole.
And do you think, just to add, jump on top of your question, Bruce, about the habitats, Randy, is your data being used by U.S. Fish and Wildlife to make ecological management decisions about the habitats in the area?
Well, potentially. We're now finally at the point where we've collected enough data where we can sort of do some of those analyses about survival and productivity and everything using the MAPS protocol. You need to have at least 5 years of data, and our first year was really kind of a pilot year. So now we've got 6. So we're at that point where we're actually going to start doing those analyses. And I didn't even mention that part of the protocol is that you also do some vegetation surveys as part of that too. So we will be able to tie those demographic metrics back to the habitats that are there. And definitely part of the reason why the Refuge staff is excited about having us there is because they want to learn about those things as well and put that into use as they think about their habitat management that they're doing.
Oh, thank you. Let's see. I think there are a couple other questions. I want to make sure I'm not missing anything. A question from Sally is, can you age older birds?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it depends a bit on the species. So I would say, most of the passerines, pretty hard to age them beyond, an after second year bird, because once they get into that basic plumage, and are molting all their feathers, at the same time every year, it's pretty hard to tell, exactly how many different generations of feathers that bird has had. But there are some feathers like woodpeckers in particular that will retain some of those feathers for more than just 1 year. And so it's possible to age a woodpecker to sometimes 3 or 4 years. And so there are some species, but it really depends on if they're retaining those feathers over multiple years, and you can see that difference in the feather tracks over a period of time.
Sophia's asking, has there been any concern for predators who learn to pick off birds in mist nets?
I'll take that one. We're lucky. I've worked at a lot of different banding stations, and I have seen that happen before, where you have a predator that will learn that a mist net is a good spot to get a meal. I think we've been pretty fortunate at Fort River. I don't think that certainly in the time I've been there, there's been no evidence of predation at the net. It could, it's potential. Obviously, there are predators out there, but it's relatively rare. Even the places where there were issues, it was very infrequent. And I think there was a place in California that I worked one time that had a pretty high population of bobcats, and they learned, and we used to chase them away from the net lanes when they were cruising along. But for the most part, Fort River, we just haven't seen any kind of issues.
All right, Janice at Zepco, she's asking, have you considered the Stebbins Refuge in Long Meadow as a potential MAPS station?
We personally have not, just because running one is probably enough for us at this point. It would be fun to do more, but we have other tasks we have to do as well. But there has been some banding done there as part of a migratory stopover habitat study a few years ago. So we think that would be a good place as well to do more banding, but we probably aren't going to be doing it ourselves.
And then Jacob is asking, this was probably mentioned, but what was the most successful year for banding? If it was or wasn't, how did the environmental conditions of that year determine the abundance or desolation of the population density?
Yeah, so I think 2017 was our highest number of birds that we captured. In total, between new birds that we banded and then recaptures, we handled over, I think it was about 230 birds that summer. And I think that was the summer when we had one day where we caught 63 birds in a morning. So our typical number is probably somewhere around 30. But as I recall, that summer was just kind of a great combination of enough moisture throughout the summer, and sort of pleasant temperatures, not too hot, not too cold. And those are definitely seem to be the conditions where we have the highest density of birds there. I suspect it's probably in somewhat related to the insect abundance that's there during different summers based on the environmental conditions and particularly climatic things. And so I think I mentioned that this past summer was we were kind of on the low side. I think we only banded something in 120 birds in that range. And it was just noticeably quiet out there compared to some of the other years, in part because of sometimes the conditions on a particular day when we were trying to band weren't great, but overall, I think the relatively dry conditions and relatively warm conditions this summer were not conducive to birds doing really well and having highly successful productive breeding season.
Yeah, and I'll add to that you definitely notice a smaller number of hatchier birds. This year was surprisingly few compared to what I remember from other years. And talking about insect abundance, we usually are getting completely killed by mosquitoes out there. It can be pretty brutal at Fort River on a normal moist kind of summer, but we hardly even needed any bug spray this year. It was so dry. So I think that really did affect productivity.
Janice Jorgensen asked, how many birds were recaptured this year? And out of the, if I'm understanding correctly, Janice can correct me if I'm wrong, the birds that you have banded before, and how many birds did you capture that were banded, but they were from somewhere else?
Yeah, I haven't completed the summary of all the numbers from this year yet, but I think we recaptured somewhere around 40 birds this year, which is, again, on the low side. I think it's more typical for us to, recapture anywhere from 50 to 75 birds that have already been banded. And to my knowledge, we have not captured any birds that were banded anywhere else. When we first started in 2016, there had been a couple of projects there at Fort River by UMass students who had banded, for parts of migration studies in particular. And we definitely recaptured some of those birds. But as far as I know, I don't think any of the birds we've captured have come from any place beyond Fort River.
And it looks like we have one last question is, are there any volunteer opportunities or needs for birders, and if so, contact information?
Sure. Yeah. We are open to participation from really anybody with an interest. And Laura, you can share our contact information with folks. And if you have an interest, just send Caleb and or I an email, and we'll be happy to sort of put you. We have a running list of folks who have expressed interest, from one year to the next, or when they hear about it, say, I'd love to try and do this next year. And so we'll put you on the list, and come about, early May next year, we'll start sending out information about what the schedule is looking like. And we have a sign-up sheet, kind of an online sign-up sheet for the different days, just so we can, sort of try and distribute the number of people that are there, throughout the summer, and give folks who are interested an opportunity to be there.
Oh, that's great. And so just to let everyone know, I can do that. I'll just use the list of registrants, and I can send that information to everyone so that they have it, and that'll be fabulous. And then let's see, the rest of it just says, thank you very much. Thanks so much. And thanks for joining us. So I think that's it for questions. And so have a good night, everyone. And again, thank you to Caleb and Randy for letting us know all about the bird banding program.
It's
Take care.
our pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Laura.